Elias was alone in the silent archive, and he knew two things with chilling certainty. Sarah Lin hadn't run away, and whatever she was looking for, it was still here, waiting. He looked down and saw, at his feet, half buried in the dirt, a single, fresh footprint. It was a size 7 boot. Sarah's size. She was still here. He clutched the custodian's key, turned on his heel, and started running back toward the stairs, desperate to find an exit. But as he ran, he realized the shelves had somehow shifted. The entrance tunnel was gone. The only things surrounding him were endless, towering stacks of black, silent books. Panic was a cold, constricting vice around his chest. He stopped, holding his breath, listening for anything, a voice, a footstep, the sound of the metallic crunching he'd heard moments before. Nothing. The silence here wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was a total cancellation, a crushing vacuum that pressed against his eardrums and felt like it was actively draining the noise from his own thoughts. He tried retracing his steps, counting the stacks he passed, but they defied logic. He'd walk past 5 shelves, turn a corner, and suddenly find himself back where he started, staring at a smear of slime on the concrete floor he'd just stepped in. The archive was spatial and non-Euclidean. Its architecture was not fixed. It was alive, or at least, reactive. The layout changed whenever his attention wavered. A terrible place for a mind that demands order, a rasping voice echoed, not from a specific direction, but from the humidity in the air itself. Elias spun around, his phone light shaking. The figure stood perhaps 20 feet away, still draped in the dark, heavy cloak, but now facing him. It was no longer being dragged. It stood with an unnatural stillness that bordered on skeletal. "You," Elias managed, pointing the trembling light. "Who are you?" The figure raised a long, pale hand, beckoning. "I am the archivist. I am the one who ensures the silence remains unbroken. You disturbed the harvest, boy. This space is not for recording, but for forgetting." Elias squinted at the sunken face. He saw the drooping mustache, the high forehead, the exact likeness of the marble bust he'd just left upstairs. "Archivist Thorne," he whispered. "The original. The custodian. I gave my memory to the work, and now I simply remain. You came looking for Sarah Lin. She dug too deep into the nature of the silencers, the things that dwell within these stacks. They feed on unrecorded, intellectual knowledge, transforming it into physical silence. These." Thorne gestured to the shelves of black objects. "These are not books. They are the crystallized absence of truth. The failures of memory. The devoured." Elias felt bile rise. Where is she? Sealed. Her intellect, her mathematical genius, her obsession with structure, it was a feast. She is still here, but her volume is not yet full. Thorne glided closer, his movement a disturbing, soundless drift. "But you, Elias, you have trespassed. The archive requires a toll. You must feed it to find your way out, or you become another silent volume yourself." "Feed it? How?" "It hungers for a piece of knowledge that is unique and unrecorded. Something that was, but is no more. Something that has been intentionally forgotten. Offer that, and I will show you the temporary passage back to the stairs." Elias rummaged through the small backpack he still carried. He pulled out a worn copy of the school's 1968 yearbook, his intended offering for the student council exposé. "What about this?" "The financial records of the 1968 endowment fund. They've been suppressed." Thorne made a sound like dry leaves crunching. "Trivial. Administrative deceit is common knowledge. It must be a piece of public truth that has been systematically erased. Something central to the school's foundations." Elias's phone light caught something reflective near Thorne's feet. It was a familiar navy blue backpack, Sarah Lin's. He lunged for it, scooping it up, ignoring Thorne's dry hiss of annoyance. Inside, he found a notebook filled with Sarah's meticulous, elegant script. It wasn't research on the school. It was a scientific catalog. She had drawn complex diagrams of the silencers, amorphous, sightless creatures that had no discernible sensory organs but reacted violently to linguistic structures. She called them vermis tenebrarum, shadow worms. Her final, frantic entry was a map of the archive itself, scrawled on the back page. It wasn't geographical. It was a time map. She noted that the archive's layout stabilized for a brief window every 6 hours, when the moisture content in the cornerstone was at its lowest. That window was rapidly closing. He had to move now. He needed to find the truth Thorne demanded before the next shift. As Elias hurried down a side aisle, searching for the symbol Sarah mentioned, the broken clock face, his phone beam fell upon a cluster of 3 small, identical black books set apart on a lower shelf. They were smaller and older than the rest. As he reached out, a vision slammed into his mind, immediate and terrifying. He was no longer Elias. He was a young man in a 1950s varsity sweater, pressed against the cold stone, screaming soundlessly as wispy, black shadows peeled the words from his tongue and the equations from his mind, turning his entire intellectual identity into inert matter. The vision lasted only a second, leaving Elias gasping, his hands shaking. These were the 3 missing students Marcus had mentioned. They hadn't died. They had been crystallized. Driven by a terrible urgency, Elias forced himself to focus. He saw it. Scratched into the base of a shelf, almost hidden by dust and slime, was the symbol, a clock face with only the number 12, clearly marked, and all the hands broken. This was Sarah's clue. It represented the precise 6-hour window of stability. He looked back at his own phone's clock, 3:45 a.m. He had maybe 15 minutes before the next fundamental shift. He pushed past the shelf bearing the clock face. The stacks, which had been pressing in, now seemed to hold their breath. The path before him felt solid, fixed. Elias ran. He scrambled back the way he thought he came, following Sarah's time map logic. He reached the narrow, stone tunnel and burst onto the winding stairs. He didn't stop until he was clawing at the wrought iron door. Using the custodian's key and the smaller Veritas key, he unlocked the iron barrier and stumbled out into the library's vast, dark corridor. The metallic smell of the archive clung to him. He found himself in a state of hyper-awareness, the smell of dust and old wood upstairs feeling suddenly warm and safe. He didn't notice the janitor, Mr. Hemlock, until the man's flashlight beam hit him square in the eyes. "Vance, what in God's name are you doing down here at this hour? And what is that muck all over you?" Hemlock, a wizened man who had worked at Ashwood for 40 years, was known for his ironclad loyalty to the headmaster. I was doing research for my exposé," Elias stammered, pointing vaguely at Sarah's backpack, which he quickly swung behind him. "The historical archives are huge. I must have fallen asleep down in the West Wing before the night lock." Hemlock narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing the custodian's key in Elias's hand. "That is the key to the restricted non-circulating section. That is a firing offense, Vance. Give it here." Elias, still buzzing with adrenaline, knew he couldn't surrender the key. "I found it. On the floor. I was going to turn it in first thing." Before Hemlock could move, Elias bolted, sprinting past the busts and through the main reading room, adrenaline giving him impossible speed. He escaped out a side door and vanished into the fading night, reaching his dorm just as the first gray light of dawn broke. He crashed onto his bed, soaked and shaking, the custodian's key and Sarah's backpack clutched tight. He didn't sleep. The first thing he did was examine the items he'd brought back. The heavy iron key was now slightly warmer. The second was Sarah's backpack. Inside, beneath the research notes, he found a small, obsidian-colored object. It was the size and shape of a compact paperback, but impossibly heavy, and it absorbed all light. It was one of the black books from the archive shelves. As Elias touched it, a faint, metallic odor, the smell of the archive, leaked onto his fingers. He opened the book. The pages were blank, perfectly smooth, and cold. But as he stared, the first line of an old, embarrassing memory, a secret he thought only he knew, seemed to bleed across the page in silvery, metallic script. The book was a recorder, a memory collector, and now that it was outside the archive, it was actively hunting for new, unrecorded knowledge to turn into silence. It was marking him. Elias quickly wrapped the terrifying object in thick cloth and buried it at the bottom of his laundry hamper, far from his research notes. He focused on Sarah's journal. She hadn't been just researching the silencers. She was tracking the school's most closely guarded secret, the Ashwood Covenant. Using her fragmented clues in a legitimate history book on 19th-century New England institutions, Elias pieced together the truth. Ashwood Academy was not founded on mere philanthropy. It was built atop a natural locus of psychic energy, a weak point in the membrane between dimensions. The founders, a group of esoteric scholars, discovered that this location could naturally amplify intellectual focus. But it came at a cost. The original archivist, Elias Thorne, had struck a bargain with the silencers. They would grant the school unprecedented academic success, a conveyor belt of genius students, in exchange for a harvest of that genius, which would be silenced forever and stored in the archive. The black books were the physical manifestation of this trade. The broken clock face was a reference to the school's benefactor, not the one on the fountain, but the true one, Clement Davies. Davies, a forgotten textile tycoon, had donated the land after his public reputation was ruined by a massive industrial scandal in 1888. The school officially celebrated the benefactor's generosity, but erased all mention of his crime and his name. The clock face symbol on the archives meant that the true founder's time was over. His story was literally silenced. Elias had found the truth the archivist demanded: the intentional erasure of Clement Davies's crime. His immediate goal shifted. He needed proof the headmaster was continuing the ritual, and he needed to know the exact location of Sarah's confinement, the Apex book. Elias knew the current headmaster, Jonathan Thorne, was the great-grandson of the archivist. It stood to reason that the Thorne family was maintaining the covenant. He waited until after the evening faculty meeting, the most reliable time headmaster Thorne was distracted, and broke into the headmaster's sprawling, ancestral office. The room was dark wood and leather, dominated by a large portrait of the original archivist Thorne, his eyes cold and judgmental. Elias found a hidden floor safe beneath a loose Persian rug. Using a simple wire and Sarah's knowledge of the Thorne family's predictable 19th-century lock preference, he managed to trip the mechanism. Inside, nestled amongst outdated ledgers and share certificates, was a large, leather-bound diary, Headmaster Jonathan Thorne's personal journal. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs as he read the shaky, modern script. September 23. Lin. She is too close. The girl found the Covenant Council charter, the original, bloody documents. She threatened exposure, claiming the sacrifice of the few outweighed the intellectual good of the many. Foolish idealism. She has been delivered to the silent archive. A necessary step. The harvest is due. The hunger cannot be ignored, and my time as custodian is waning. I must appoint a successor. I have chosen Kale. He is selfish and driven, perfect for the role. The ritual of silence is scheduled for 1 a.m., September 30th. Tonight, Elias felt a wave of icy despair. Tonight, He looked at the date on his phone. September 30th. He had less than 4 hours. Headmaster Thorne was not just silencing Sarah. He was preparing to sacrifice Marcus Cale as the new eternal archivist. He slammed the journal shut. He had the truth the archive demanded. The suppressed crime of Clement Davies. Now he needed a plan to get in, disrupt the ritual, and save both Sarah and Marcus. He found Marcus Cale in the gym, shooting hoops alone, a common form of stress relief for the calculating senior. Marcus looked up, his face immediately wary. "Don't tell me I owe you another favor, Vance," Marcus said, spinning a basketball on a pale finger. Elias dropped the custodian's key onto the highly polished court floor. It hit with a heavy thud. "I'm not here for a favor, Marcus. I'm here for a partnership. Headmaster Thorne intends to sacrifice you tonight at 1 a.m. He needs a new custodian to run the archive, and you fit the profile. Smart, cold, and easily controllable. I have the key, and Sarah's location. You have the access codes to the old Bell system and the necessary cynicism to survive what's down there." Marcus stopped spinning the ball. His mask of arrogant superiority cracked, revealing genuine, stark fear. He recognized the heavy, iron key and the metallic smell clinging to Elias. "The ritual of silence," Marcus breathed, his voice barely audible. "I thought that was a myth the faculty told each other when they got drunk." "It's real." Elias nodded, grabbing the key. "Real, and due tonight. Thorne's confession is in his journal. I saw it. The silencers are starved. They'll take you and turn your ambition into dust." Marcus's survival instinct immediately kicked in. "The Bell system. The old one. It's on a separate circuit from the modern fire alarms. I can flood the basement level. The archives are pre-modern. They won't stand up to a large volume of water. It should act as a buffer, a psychic shield, enough to slow the things." "Good. We go in when the ritual is starting. I'll make the offering. The truth they want, to shatter the stacks. You get the fire alarms ready. We hit the archive, find the Apex book, and get Sarah out." They descended the stairs just before 1 a.m. Marcus, carrying a small, waterproof radio, stood guard by the wrought iron door. Elias, armed with the custodian's key and a single piece of paper bearing the truth of Clement Davies, went down alone. The air was already humming with the strange, cold, electric energy. It was louder now, more concentrated. The soundlessness was a tangible pressure, and the metallic copper smell was overwhelming. Elias reached the bottom landing and crept into the vast, low-ceilinged chamber. In the center of the largest aisle, a horrifying tableau was unfolding. Headmaster Thorne, dressed in a black ceremonial robe that echoed the one worn by the original archivist, stood before a crude stone altar. Two other senior faculty members, Professor Alistair from the Classics Department and Dean Selwyn from Mathematics, stood at his side, holding candelabras of black wax that did not shed light, but seemed to drink it. Marcus Cale was there too, standing rigidly next to the altar. He was utterly still, his eyes wide and unfocused. The headmaster had already used some form of mental compulsion. "Tonight, we cleanse the palate of the archive," Thorne intoned, his voice booming and amplified by the strange acoustics. "We offer up the next custodian, a vessel of ambition, ready to maintain the covenant. The silencers shall feed, and Ashwood shall prosper for another 20 years." As Thorne raised a heavy, ritualistic knife, the shadows began to detach from the walls. They were not just wisps now. They coalesced into tall, serpentine shapes that slithered toward Marcus, their non-existent faces turned toward the young man's rich mental energy. "No!" Elias roared, disrupting the ceremony. Headmaster Thorne whipped around, his face contorted into a mask of pure, murderous rage. "Vance, you foolish, Insignificant boy. You will be dust. Elias ignored him. He knew the silencers reacted to sound and knowledge. He had to overload the system. He held up the piece of paper containing the forgotten truth about Clement Davies. The archives are a lie. The original benefactor, Clement Davies, didn't donate this land out of generosity. He funded the school to cover up the death of 22 laborers in his collapsed textile mill. That knowledge was sealed and forgotten to preserve the purity of the Academy's name. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The shelves of black books surrounding them began to vibrate violently. The crystalline silence couldn't absorb the sound of a deliberately erased, central truth being spoken aloud in its core. The books shuddered, and then, with a sound like a million pieces of glass shattering at once, they exploded. Black dust, crystallized knowledge, and shards of pure silence erupted everywhere, confusing and temporarily disabling the silencers, which writhed, exposed and vulnerable, now that their containers were gone. The headmaster screamed, "The Covenant! You've ruined the Covenant!" Elias charged, pushing past the plume of black dust. He saw Marcus, still paralyzed by the compulsion, staring blankly. "Sarah!" Elias shouted. "Where is the apex book?" Thorne, now frantic, tried to lunge at Elias, but the dust was clinging to him. "She is sealed. In the great volume. Her genius is the foundation." Elias saw it. At the very end of the chamber, where the tunnel narrowed into the bedrock, stood a single, massive volume taller than a man, bound in thick, scarred iron. The apex book. Elias ran, dodging the enraged headmaster, whose eyes were now glowing with a sickly yellow light. He was being possessed by the very power he sought to control. He reached the apex book. It was secured by a heavy, ornate latch. It was the original lock from the 19th century, complex and brutal. Elias thrust the small brass Veritas key, the one Sarah had forged, into the secondary tumbler. It clicked. He then used the custodian's key on the main lock. With a final, echoing KR chunk, the lock released. He threw the massive, iron cover open. Sarah Lin was inside. She was conscious, but barely. She wasn't physically confined, but mentally tethered. She was sitting upright, but her skin was translucent, and her eyes were fixed on the vast, empty iron pages surrounding her. Her hands were extended, and faint, blue lines of energy, her very thought processes, were being drawn from her fingertips and sucked into the pages, cooling like ink. She was fading, her magnificent mind being siphoned away. Elias grabbed her wrist. Her skin was freezing, dry as parchment. "Sarah, I'm getting you out." He pulled, hard. Sarah let out a soundless, high-pitched noise, like a tuning fork hitting a frequency too high for human hearing. She tumbled out onto the floor, weak and disoriented, her eyes swimming. At that moment, Marcus's radio crackled in Elias's pocket. "Now, Vance. Now or never." The fire alarms above ground began to wail, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the archive's silence. Then, with a roar like a distant train, water began to pour down the stairwell, black and filthy, surging into the basement. The water was a shockwave. The ethereal bodies of the silencers shrieked, dissolving instantly upon contact with the liquid. They couldn't consume matter. They could only consume absence. The headmaster, still possessed by the malignant power, let out a final, chilling howl of despair as the rising tide engulfed him. He didn't try to flee. He was consumed not by the water, but by the remaining, starved silencers, who, now completely disorganized, turned on the nearest source of intellect, the knowledge the headmaster himself had tried to hoard. Elias lifted Sarah's limp body and stumbled, wading through the rising black water, back towards the stairs. He found Marcus waiting nervously, his hand already on the door lock. They escaped the archive just as the water level reached their shoulders. The official report was published a week later. Headmaster Jonathan Thorne, Dean Selwyn, and Professor Alistair were reported missing, presumed to have fled after an unreported chemical leak in the library basement. The entire Foundation wing was sealed off, this time with concrete, steel, and multiple layers of chemical containment, a lie built on a deeper, more terrifying truth. Marcus Cale, shaken but alive, used the knowledge he gained of the Covenant Council, the names of the board members who sanctioned the ritual, to blackmail the school into securing his own safe passage to an Ivy League institution, ensuring his silence and freedom. His arrogance was back, but his eyes held a shadow that hadn't been there before. Sarah Lin was taken home by her family. Elias visited her 3 months later. She was physically recovered, but profoundly changed. She couldn't read or write the way she used to. The silencers hadn't killed her, but they had taken her methodology, her ability to process and structure intellectual thought. They took the structure, she whispered to Elias, sitting in her sunlit room. The language of the external world. The notes, the equations, it's all gone. She looked at him, and her eyes, though vacant of her old, analytical fire, now held a strange, unsettling peace. But I can hear the unrecorded language now, Elias. The truth that even the silencers couldn't touch. She reached out and placed a small, elegant note in his hand. It wasn't written language, but a single, perfect symbol, an open hand cradling a blank page. Elias left her and returned to Ashwood to finish his senior year. He wrote the entire, terrifying story of the Covenant, the silencers, and the ritual, the true narrative. He realized no one would publish it. Anyone who read it would be drawn to the new, more dangerous silence that now hung over the library. He burned the manuscript in a small, contained fire in his dorm fireplace. One cold afternoon, Elias walked past the newly sealed area of the library foundation. The stone was fresh, gray, and cold. He noticed it immediately. A single, small, almost undetectable crack had already formed near the cornerstone. A faint, cold breath, smelling of copper and ozone, leaked out, a ghost of the archive's hunger. The mystery was solved. The silencers were merely sleeping, but the horror remained. The school was a monument to a terrible bargain, and Elias Vance now carried the most dangerous secret of all. The truth that Ashwood Academy was not built for learning, but for harvest. And the harvest would come again. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you